Hello everyone. In the field of language documentation and revitalization, there is now an increasing awareness about the need for positivity, a shift of focus from language death to language life. My presentation today is a reflection in this direction. I am Vijay D'Souza from Northeastern Institute of Language and Culture, Guwahati, India. And my presentation is titled Language Celebration as a Resilience Strategy. I define language celebration as a planned public event which generates positive feelings in the members of a linguistic community towards their language. A planned public event could be an event celebrating the language itself. For example, Kannada Rajyotsava or Kannada Statehood Festival, which also celebrate the Kannada language in Karnataka, India. Or such a celebration could be any other celebration involving skillful use and enjoyment of the language in question. For example, stand-up comedy, drama, musical performances, poetry, and so on. A planned public event, that is language celebration, is not merely a public event, for example, organized by a political or cultural entity out of compulsion without any joy in it. It is conditional upon its end result in my definition as I use in this presentation today. That is, end result is positive feeling towards a, a given language. Its focus is on intersubjectivity and not mere objectivity. That is, just because people gather in the name of language, it doesn't become language celebration. Social interaction and positive feeling towards the language are very important. This is a broad definition. That is, social interaction can be face-to-face or remote, in person or online, that is, or synchronous or asynchronous. For example, a music album is a celebration of language in this sense, but it is asynchronous. To understand the concept of resilience, I take this definition by Bonanno, 2004. Uh, he is a psychologist, and in his seminal paper on resilience, he wrote, resilience is the ability of those exposed to a highly disruptive or traumatic event to maintain relatively stable, healthy psychological and physical functioning levels. We know that language loss is a highly disruptive event in the life of a community. How does a community bounce back and maintain a relatively stable and healthy psychological, physical functioning levels? That's the question. I also have drawn insights from these papers on resilience linguistics and resilience thinking by Roche 2017 and Bradley 2010 and 2020. The background of my presentation today is the tremendous progress in language documentation and reclamation since the 1990s in terms of tools and techniques, theorization, and praxis. However, Gerald Roach makes this devastating and humbling assessment of our field. For all the achievement of documentary linguistics in terms of its documentary, descriptive, and scientific goals, sadly, after millions of dollars, countless hours of efforts, and so many documentary corpora, theses, and articles, the overall impact on worldwide language endangerment has been minimal, as this pie chart shows. Today, there are 43% of world languages that are endangered. Minoritized, and indigenous languages are still being pushed towards extinction. So the question is, why has documentary linguistics by and large failed to prevent language endangerment? Various reasons can be listed to answer this question, like salvage linguistics, which is a familiar term for those involved in language documentation. Zombie linguistics, as called out by Perley. He explains how in zombie linguistics the whole focus is on archiving rather than focusing on the living language. Point and shoot linguistics, hurried documentary linguistics, where someone goes to the so-called field and collects as much data as possible in as little time as possible, and goes back to the university or wherever they are based, and then makes a career for themselves. There is also bounty hunter linguistics, where an adventurer must travel to the ends of the earth to capture and rescue language and bring that bounty to for his professor or for his archive or whatever. Um, as we can see, all these models of linguistics have very little to do with the community. Another unhelpful way of going about is viewing a language as merely a scientific object, ignoring its political, socio-cultural, emotional, and spiritual components. Calling for a shift of focus from language as an object in itself to the community of speakers. Language endangerment as a human rights issue pioneered by Skutner Kangas and others. Political processes of language oppression, focusing on these issues as proposed by Gerald Roach in various papers, and a shift of focus from gloom and doom linguistics and zombie linguistics to a more hope-based approaches. For example, Burley, Hinton, etc. Perley has this concept of emergent vitalities as an antidote to zombie linguistics. Emergent vitalities is an important concept for our purposes in this presentation. Perley calls for a conceptual and metaphorical shift from endangerment and extinction to language life. And language life, he says, is contingent upon social relationships. In order to revitalize heritage languages, one must revitalize existing and emergent social relationships and their language practices and domains. That is, a language cannot be revitalized in itself or in a vacuum. It can be revitalized only if the social relationships and language practices and domains pertaining to those social relationships are revitalized. In this presentation, I take Perley's reflection further and I propose that language celebration is a highly effective but seldom explored strategy for restoring and maintaining language vitality of oppressed languages. I argue also for a more central role to language celebration in the praxis of language documentation and reclamation. We know that language oppression has devastating consequences for the linguistically oppressed communities. They often go through collective grief, trauma, anger, and despair at the loss of their languages. Different communities respond differently to language oppression. Often there is a sense of resignation, fatalism, and abandonment of their heritage language. But this need not be always the case. In response to language oppression, certain communities may come up with narratives of anger, sense of victimhood, protest, and resistance. Many communities fight back. They take actions towards language emancipation by fighting back. Often the only way towards language survival and revival is this kind of fight back. Um, uh, they are also powerful means of channeling the collective energy when there is collective anger, collective angst at the loss of language. That becomes a way or means of channeling collective energy in a community towards language emancipation. And also, we know that rights will never be given by the oppressor unless demanded and fought for. But there are also certain inherent limitations and dangers of anger and sense of victimhood. For example, although these are necessary and important in the short term, they can be pathological in the long term. They produce chronic stress, especially anger produces chronic stress, and collective anger can produce chronic stress in communities and also at the individual level. There is possibility of battle fatigue. Fights for for language rights are often long drawn out, and there can be battle fatigue after some time, and people may just give up fighting. And there is also the question of historic trauma aggravation. Already there is a feeling and there's this trauma that is passed on from generation to generation, and narratives of anger and sense of victimhood can aggravate that. I propose that a paradigm of celebration-based linguistic work as a resilience strategy is necessary to counterbalance such harmful effects, and it must go hand in hand with the fight for linguistic justice. This proposal is based on the insights on the role of positive emotions in achieving resilience by Bonanno and many other psychologists who study especially human resilience. A possible way of understanding the connection between language celebration and positive emotions is Through the lens of behavioral psychology, especially the concept of the positive reinforcement cycle. Let's say there is a stimuli, for example, stimuli can be objects, events, situations, and activities, as Schultz explains in his paper. Then there is an engagement with stimuli, and if that engagement brings reward, because of that reward there is positive emotions, especially there is pleasure attached to that reward, and that positive emotion or set of positive emotions create an approach behavior. There is a desire to approach that stimuli again, and a person or a group of persons will actively seek to approach the stimuli. This is approach behavior. We can use this concept to explain what happens in the case of an oppressed language. In the case of an oppressed language, there is negative reinforcement, not positive reinforcement. This is how it works. There is heritage language and some sort of engagement by the speaker with the heritage language. And as a result of this engagement, there is punishment, as they use in behavioral psychology. A punishment is ridicule, shaming, and physical or mental harassment, maybe in a school situation, in the marketplace, by peers, etc. And because of the punishment, there is a set of negative emotions that are generated in the speaker, and those negative emotions lead to avoidance behavior. The speaker will not approach the heritage language again. He or she will seek another language in order to avoid all these negative emotions. Language celebration is a powerful means by which we can turn a negative reinforcement cycle into a positive one. We can explain this as follows. So here in this case, the stimuli is the language celebration itself. It can be events, event art, situations and activities pertaining to the language in question. And a speaker engages with this stimuli, and it brings reward, the pleasure of engaging with their own language, like participating, organizing, speaking, the community bond that it generates, and the sense of belonging, and so forth. And that reward brings in positive emotions, and due to this positive emotions, a speaker seeks more language-related events, situations, and activities, that is more stimuli of this sort. So instead of avoidance behavior, the behavior now is approach behavior, and more language celebration is sought, and this cycle continues in this way. Now I come to the question of what concretely is language celebration, or ways of celebrating a language. Language can be celebrated by means of celebratory events, for example, language festivals and competitions, or celebratory online content, for example, social media content, TikTok, etc. And celebratory literature and art, poetry, storybooks, and so forth. Humor is a very powerful means of language celebration. Celebratory storytelling, for example, through short films, podcasts, and so forth, and religious celebrations. There are many more ways of celebrating a language, but I'm just listing a few here. Now I would like to give the case studies of 3 different languages from 3 different language families, all minority languages in their own states. These languages have either survived or maintained themselves, or bounced back from the edge of extinction due to language celebration. First example is that of Tulu. Tulu is a thriving minority Dravidian language spoken by about 1.8 million people in Karnataka, India, but it's a minority language in that state. It has relatively very sparse written literature, and there's no institutional support, mostly spoken language, but it is known for its thriving theatre. There are 2 prominent genres, Hindu religious epics and humor, that are celebrated in various ways. It's very specially known for its humorous plays, films, and videos. A language whose speakers immensely enjoy speaking, listening, and celebrating humor. Let's listen to a short clip.
Sir, idaya unnutu koti ವ್ಯವಹಾರದ ನೆತ ವಿಷಯ ಇತ್ತು ಬಂತು ಇಂಕಂಚಿನ ದಾಲೆಜ್ಜಿ ಇಂಕೈಟ್ ಕಾಲಿ ತೆಗೆದಿನ ಮೂಜಿ ಕೋಟಿ ಮಾತ್ರ
There's no major significant institutional support. It is spoken in the families, and it thrives and survives because of humor and celebration of the language. The next example is that of Mangalorean Konkani, a dialect of Konkani spoken by about 400,000 people, the Catholic community of Mangalore. There is no institutional support in terms of education. It's spoken only in families and at church. There were in the past two major religious and linguistic persecutions. First of all, by the Portuguese in the 16th and 17th century, and a king called Tipu Sultan in the 18th century, which nearly led to the complete wiping out of the community. About 60,000 of these Mangalorean Catholics were captured and taken as prisoners to his capital, and only 15,000 returned. But the community survived because of its liturgical tradition. There is an epic called Krista Purana, which was originally written by a missionary called Thomas Stevens, and then recited by the elders of the community. And during the captivity, the second captivity, they kept reciting these poems in the prisons, and that's how they kept their identity and the language alive. The third example is that of Oso Aka. I've been privileged to work with Oso Aka language and the Oso Aka people for the last 23 years. Currently, there are about 4,000 speakers, and Oso Aka is experiencing rapid shift towards Hindi in certain pockets, although it is showing the signs of revival, as we shall see. The orthography and the first printed book was published in 1999, and official approval of the orthography came in 2017 by the approval by the apex body Akashut Kokunu. And I was involved in a ELDP documentation project from 2015 to 2020, and during the documentation, even before that, we were a team of 5, 6, and now 14 people, and we produce storybooks, mobile keyboards, talking dictionary, and alphabet chart until 2019. These initiatives and the documentation project itself was very successful in creating awareness, but we noticed that there was only a slow change in language attitudes, especially the amount of pride that people had in their own language. In 2021, the Aka Language Academy was formed with 14 members who were involved in the earlier language documentation. And in one of the meetings, this thought of changing the strategy of language revitalization came up, and building on the previous success, a shift of focus towards language celebration was made. The question now became, what would people enjoy? What outputs would people enjoy? And as a result, various initiatives were taken. One of the ideas that came up was our people are generally very curious about news, and they every day watch news in Hindi at home. So therefore, why don't we come up with weekly news broadcasts in our own language, especially the local news. And we began a weekly news broadcast, and it became a huge and instant success. Another idea was that people would enjoy participating in competitions. So we had competitions last year, first on the International Mother Language Day on the 21st of February, and the Global Language Advocacy Day on the 22nd of February. Yet another idea was to make a textbook with completely original art drawn by an Aka artist himself, one who would understand the culture from within. This is one of the beautiful drawings that he made for our textbook. Another idea that came up was to compose rhymes for children so that they can enjoy their own language. Initially, we composed just one, and we wanted to test whether children would enjoy those rhymes or not. And this video shows how much they actually enjoyed.
누구냐 제다 제비?
누구냐 얘가 애비?
Hukeje chejebi. Hukeje chejebi. O anerane hoya hoi. O anerane
Hoya hoi. They clap and laugh and enjoy when that portion O Aniranya Hoya Hoi comes. Encouraged by this experience, we had a poetry workshop in June 2021 here at NELAC, and we now have about 15 rhymes for children, which we intend to disseminate throughout the Oso Aka area. The result of all these initiatives, especially celebrating the language and creating a very positive attitude towards the language, is that Oso Aka is showing signs of a successful revival and resilience. Alarm about the language endangerment did not help much. People would say they are sad about the situation of the language, but what can we do? We are a small linguistic group. Language celebration with a message of hope was more effective for us. A few reflections to conclude my presentation today. First of all, it is important to create opportunities for joy, laughter, and pleasant memories in language reclamation through language celebration, because language celebration works and it is an effective resilience and reclamation strategy. Secondly, language celebration energizes a community. Celebration brings enjoyment, it reduces collective stress, it promotes mental and physical well-being and generates pleasant memories. It creates positive reinforcement cycles and nurtures positive feelings towards one's language and common identity. Language celebration is also an act of defiance. That is because things that are esteemed, and only those things that are esteemed, are publicly celebrated. Through language celebration, community members demonstrate that they esteem and value their language. This defies the oppressor's assertion that the victim's language or culture is primitive and valueless. Language celebration is also a very effective resistance method against erasure. Language celebration counteracts the colonial or the neoliberal project of the erasure of minoritized languages and cultures. Celebration acts as a tool of resistance by keeping memories, identities, and linguistic heritage alive and safe from erasure. Thank you very much for participating. Here is a list of references.